I ended the last episode with a cliffhanger, when the judge who was to decide whether Tomasz Komenda could eventually leave jail said that, in this case, there were no grounds to allow a prison leave. Everyone's hearts dropped, stomachs sank. And then the judge continued, prison leave is used when the inmate is unable to stay in prison, for example, due to health reasons, and that's not the case here. So, as everyone in the courtroom understood, despite all the evidence, Komenda was still supposed to stay in jail. Even though it was obvious he's not guilty, the district court would not allow him to leave because they apparently would rather wait for the Supreme Court's decision on acquittal. But before anyone managed to express their disbelief or anger, the judge calmly continued, Tomasz Komenda has been released on parole with a probation period of 10 years. The suspense the judge created was unforgivable. I guess that the entire Komenda family was on the verge of a heart attack or a stroke when the judge said he's not allowing the prison leave. At the same time, it's hard not to be thankful, because the parole is much better. Parole meant that unless Tomasz Komenda breaks the probation rules, he's never going back to prison. It wasn't a vacation from his jail time. He was actually free. His sentence was over. He was going home after 18 years of hopelessness, abuse, helplessness, fear, and longing for his family. And even though leaving jail was something he probably wanted more than anything, adjusting to being back in the open world that had drastically changed over almost 20 years was insanely hard. You remember Brooks from Shawshank Redemption? So I guess it was something like that. But journalists and TV cameras following you everywhere, plus an insane amount of trauma after jail and living with the stigma of a child rapist and murderer for so many years. Thankfully, Tomasz Komenda wasn't alone. His family never left him and never doubted him. On the day when he was leaving prison, a bunch of reporters were waiting outside the correctional center with their cameras and microphones ready. Every time the door opened, everyone would move except for the Komenda family, who knew what time more or less Tomasz was supposed to show up at the door. And when it finally happened, after many hours of waiting, when the door opened and first the police officer showed up clearing the way for the most famous and justly convicted person in the country, it clearly showed that Tomasz Komenda didn't feel like talking with the media. He was instantly pulled towards a car by his mom and brothers and then brought safely home, the same home he was taken from 18 years earlier. He was welcomed with his favorite food and a placard that read, "Welcome home, Tomek," after 6,540 days. Even though Tomasz was 41 at the time, he had never lived alone before, so it was obvious that his family was not going to try to help him find his new apartment, at least not for the first few months after he left jail, but instead, he had a bedroom prepared at his parents' place. It was all to make him feel safe and not lonely. Besides, like I said earlier, the world changed so much from the year 2000, when Tomasz was arrested, to the year 2018, when he was released, that he had to learn how to function in this new world, and he wouldn't be able to do this without the help of his family. He got his first cell phone, learned about the internet, discovered fast food restaurants, saw new cars, new buildings, and new streets in his hometown. And at the same time, especially at the beginning, he mentally still was in jail, living in the regimen of waking up and going to bed at a certain hour. Sometimes he would lie on the bed without a word for hours, and God only knows what was going on in this head of his, what he was remembering. He also still waited for the Supreme Court's verdict on acquittal, and in the meantime, he would meet with journalists for interviews and started therapy to try to deal with what he went through. It must have been insanely overwhelming, all of this. 2 months passed. It was the 16th of May 2018 when the Supreme Court, having learned about all the new evidence in the Miłoszyce case, was ready to announce a verdict on the acquittal of Tomasz Komenda. Tomasz and his family went to Warsaw, where the Supreme Court is located, accompanied by one of the top defense lawyers in the country, Zbigniew Ćwiąkalski, a former Minister of Justice and Attorney General. At least this time, Tomasz Komenda had a suitable representation in court. When everybody's called to hear the verdict, the biggest courtroom in the Supreme Court building is absolutely packed. Everybody wants to know if Tomasz Komenda will be officially acquitted or not. Probably every single TV and radio station sent their crew to the court today to hear and record firsthand the verdict that millions of people in Poland are impatiently waiting for. It gets respectfully quiet when the 3 judges of the Supreme Court enter the courtroom and take their seats. If you're watching this on YouTube, I would like you to look at the screen again. This video was taken by the Polish radio crew. Even if you don't understand the words, you'll still understand what's going on in the scene.
Niewinnia Tomasza Komendy powstali procesu książa Skarb Państwa do książa Skarbu Państwa.
It always gets me. When the court session ended, it was mayhem. Everybody wanted to talk with Komendy and his lawyer. Everybody wanted to know how he felt, what he was gonna do next. The Komendy family thanked everyone who made the acquittal possible, especially the prosecutors who reopened the case, and the police officers, including Remik, who followed their instinct and worked on the case for years. Tomasz Komendy said that he was grateful for his family that stood beside him all this time. He was grateful for so much support coming from people all over Poland that it just felt that everyone is keeping their fingers crossed for his acquittal, and that now all he wants to do is try and live a normal life, get used to the modern world, and maybe start a family one day. It wasn't true, however, that everybody was happy about Komendy's release from prison and acquittal. Jadwiga and Krzysztof Kwiatkowski, the parents of Małgosia, still couldn't make peace with the fact that Komendy was free. In their minds, if he was guilty in 2003 when he was first convicted, then he was guilty just the same in 2018. They couldn't understand how it was that solid evidence turned out not to be this solid, and all in all led to releasing a man who, as they thought for 18 years, brutally raped and killed their daughter. In their eyes, he was still guilty. I'm not surprised they thought this way. Those people for years heard that the evidence against Komendy was bulletproof. They might have not understood the polymarker method of testing DNA, but they probably thought, people wiser than us, scientists and lawyers, say he's guilty, and there's a way to prove it, so he's guilty. When they saw this whole, let's call it Komendy show, in the media, they were angry. Nobody's ever talked this much about their tortured daughter. Nobody remembered it was all about her. All of a sudden, Tomasz Komendy was portrayed as the biggest and main victim of the Miłoszyce case, and that was wrong. They were both victims in a different way. Chronologically, Małgosia was first, but both their stories were equally tragic. But Komendy's story was louder. And why? As heartless as I will sound right now, women and girls get raped and killed every day. To some extent, as a society, we have gotten used to it. That's why Małgosia's story never got as much media attention as the story of Tomasz Komendy. Because unjust convictions in murder cases happen quite rarely, whereas acquittals in those cases ruled after many years of jail time are almost non-existent. Komendy's release was easily the news of the year, because it was one of a kind, when rape never is. Sorry to sound so downbeat, but it was important to me to point this out. It's mind-blowing how many things we're actually able to get used to as a society. To lift your spirits up a bit and remind you that there are still good things happening in this world, I'd like to get back to the investigation, because in 2018, it was by no means completed. So, after Komendy's release from prison and acquittal, the team working on the Miłoszyce case knew they had to work harder than ever on finding all the perpetrators of the murder. The society expected justice. Releasing an innocent person was one thing, but the case obviously couldn't have been left without any convictions. There was one strong suspect, but the investigators knew that there was more than one perpetrator, and this time, unlike in 1997, everyone was determined to find all the people responsible for Małgosia's death. Like I mentioned earlier, the forensic lab was working on comparing the DNA samples from Małgosia's clothing with the DNA of men who were at the Alcatraz disco or, according to the police, could have something to do with the girl's murder. There were probably a few hundred men to check, but the effort paid off, because in September 2018, the forensic lab informed that they had found another match. Again, you may want to look at the screen if you're watching this on YouTube, as I'm showing you the extract from the Public Sex Offenders Registry. This is our match. Norbert Basiura, born in 1978 in Oława, small world. At the time of the murder, he was 18 years old. You heard about Mr. Basiura before. He is another person who was known to the police from maybe not the very beginning of the case, but a few months into it. Definitely one of the people who could be found in the first volume of the case files, confirming once again that the saying of Maciej Szuba is true for most cases. In case you don't remember him, let me remind you, Basiura was a bouncer at the Alcatraz disco, and he knew Małgosia because they lived in the same neighborhood, plus their fathers used to be colleagues. As it turned out, in the first 1997 investigation, Norbert had something to say about what happened to Małgosia, but he didn't go to the police. Instead, he chose to talk to a Radio Wrocław journalist. He met with her quite a few times, told her some weird stories that he was blackmailed by people who had something to do with the Miłoszyce case. He claimed he was attacked by the police officers who worked on the case. And then he dropped a bomb at some point, listing the names of the alleged perpetrators. His statement was recorded in case something happened to him because Norbert claimed he didn't feel safe, and he promised that he would eventually go to the police, ask them for the incognito witness status, and tell them what he knew. But that never happened. What's more, Norbert accused the journalist, who had a tape of his statement recorded, of making this whole story up. He claimed he never listed any people, and that it was the journalist who tried to pressure him into saying something he didn't want to say. And just like many other leads in this case, in the 1997 investigation, this one was also dropped at some point. I believe it was after Norbert's DNA was collected and compared with the samples from the crime scene using the polymarker method. And since there was no match, he was let go. However, we know today that 1. Not all evidence was collected during the first investigation because when it comes to the samples containing DNA, they were definitely made from a few hairs left at the crime scene, but some biological traces had not been discovered until 20 years later, when modern technology was used, especially UV lamps and luminol, that revealed more traces. And 2, we know very well at this point that the polymarker method was very simple, too simple, and it's safe to say today that it was pretty much useless. I talked about this many times before. So Basiura was in the files, but there was no evidence that he had anything to do with this case. There was no history of his violence against women. He was not known as a sexual predator, as opposed to Matuszak. Nothing like that. It doesn't mean, however, that Basiura was an angel. He was known for his short temper. Everybody knew that he kept a baseball bat in the trunk of his car, just in case. He would get into physical fights quite often, and it seemed as if he somewhat enjoyed it, which might be one of the reasons why he got an extra job as a bouncer in a village disco, apart from being a firefighter. Both jobs bring a lot of adrenaline for different reasons. They might make you feel like an alpha male. They also mean working with a bunch of other guys, which can be influential, especially if a teenage boy tries to prove himself to others, show off his stamina, bravery, or even something as stupid as his ability to consume a large amount of alcohol. So what I see here, and what could potentially matter in this case, is 1, a certain level of aggression in Norbert's behavior, and I take that from his fondness for fights, also with the use of a baseball bat, so quite hardcore, and 2, the willingness to prove himself, show off, show everyone what an alpha male he was, especially as a young firefighter. At the same time, I don't see any aggression towards women here. And one last thing about Basiura is that he was known for his crazy affection and jealousy over his future wife. At the end of 1996, the two of them weren't even a couple yet, although Norbert wanted that very badly. So much so that when he found out that there was another guy also interested in his girl, Norbert didn't hesitate to go to this guy and threaten him, demanding that the rival leave the girl alone. He also went a step further, because Norbert listed his rival as one of the men who allegedly attacked Małgosia. It happened during this memorable conversation with the Radio Wrocław journalist. Today, it looks like he tried to make sure that this other guy was eliminated from the competition for a dream girl. Norbert might have chickened out, though. Maybe he realized that he might actually ruin the other guy's life because he never told the police that he suspected this other guy of being responsible for Małgosia's death. He only said it to the journalist. One of the prosecutors working on this case thought that if Norbert really considered his rival a dangerous person, a person who took part in the rape and murder of a teenage girl, a girl he knew, may I remind you, then he would at least warn his future wife about the danger. But he never did that. If, for some reason, he wouldn't want to tell her that she might be in danger because, let's say, he didn't want to scare her, then why didn't he tell the police about his suspicions? My guess would be that he never said anything to the investigators because he knew it was all bullshit. It was safe to make this story up and tell it to the journalist, hoping that the word would eventually spread among the locals and maybe even reach the girl Norbert liked, but at the same time, there would be no consequences for officially pointing his finger at an innocent man. The gossip was great. It staved off suspicions from him, gave an alternative suspect without having to lie at the police station, and likely helped him win his girl. Because eventually, Norbert managed to not only date, but also marry the girl he was fighting so hard and dirty for. They're still together. His wife is his biggest supporter, and she does not believe that Norbert is guilty of what he was accused of. And bless her heart. So, what is the evidence against Basiura? Of course, it's mostly DNA, but I haven't told you yet where the sample came from. It was Małgosia's dress. The same that the police in the 90s tried to return to the parents of Małgosia, and the parents refused to take it back, hoping that one day it would help resolve the case. The DNA specialist found a trace of Basiura's sperm on it. It was the most incriminating option when it comes to the case of a brutal sexual attack, exactly like it was with Matuszak. So not the saliva, not the epidermis, not even blood, but the sperm. Very hard to explain how the sperm of an 18-year-old bouncer landed on the dress of a 15-year-old girl without incriminating oneself. Just to keep things in order here, Basiura's DNA was found in 5 samples collected from Małgosia's clothes. Sources say that stains were found on Małgosia's dress and her tights. However, it is stressed that the stain on the dress was sperm, which could mean that the other stains containing DNA could have been of his blood, for example. One sample was his DNA only, because it often happens that traces mix together and something that looks like, for example, one trace of blood might actually be blood of a few people, so there will be a mixture of DNA in it. But like I said, one sample of Basiura's DNA out of 5 was 100% pure and marked by a forensic lab specialist as an extremely solid piece of evidence against Norbert Basiura. The sample was also intact after so many years, which, to Basiura's lawyer, was very suspicious. The investigators were curious about the possible explanation for how Basiura's sperm was found on Małgosia's dress. That's why an arrest warrant was issued, and Norbert Basiura was unexpectedly, for him, arrested at the end of September 2018. The first meeting with the prosecutor was interesting, to say the least. Because obviously, Norbert Basiura denied any involvement in the murder of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. When asked what he was doing on the night of the 31st of December 1996, he replied that he worked as a bouncer at the Alcatraz disco. His job was to screen and select the participants of the disco. He would put stamps on the guest hands and accept their coats in the cloakroom as well. So, when asked if he remembered Małgosia from that night, he replied that it's possible that he might have seen her, but he doesn't remember. Besides, he didn't really know Małgosia, only her father. When the prosecutor told Norbert that his DNA had been found on Małgosia's clothes, Norbert initially said he didn't know how this could be, but immediately came up with a few possible explanations. He said that having been the person he used to be, he could have gotten into a fight, injured himself, and his blood could have been transferred to Małgosia's clothes, or even splattered all around the room and landed on her. Or, as he continued, she could have been handing him her jacket, and at that moment, Norbert could have sneezed onto her jacket, or a single hair from his head could have landed on it, and voila, you have my DNA on the clothes of the victim. By the way, Małgosia didn't have her jacket on at the time of the murder. It was left in a cloakroom and then taken back to Jelcz by one of her friends. When the prosecutor corrected him, saying that Norbert's sperm was found on the victim's dress, Norbert replied, "It doesn't make any sense." After a moment, though, he came up with an explanation for that too. A police conspiracy against him. He reminded the prosecutor that in 1997, a few months after the murder, he was attacked by the police because of this case. He would get threats, death calls, and he was scared for his and his family's life. So the police conspiracy made the most sense to him at this point. The prosecutor asked if Norbert had ever been to the R family's yard where Małgosia was found, and Norbert denied. However, he said that every time he went to Miłoszyce, he would think of what happened there and it would make him feel sorry and upset, and that remembering this would be painful. This part kind of caught the prosecutor's attention because he asked, why the pain? I mean, this might seem like a stupid question given the circumstances, but I believe it was valid because this entire time, Norbert tried to convince the prosecutor that he didn't know Małgosia pretty much at all, and that the murder was so long ago that he hardly remembers anything about it, but at the same time, it still pained him 20 years later that Małgosia died. Basiura's answer to the prosecutor's question, why the pain, might be the key to understanding why he never pleaded guilty to participating in Małgosia's murder. He said that he was a firefighter. Helping people, rescuing them, was a part of his identity, his character trait. Knowing that a 15-year-old girl was hurt so brutally was painful to him as a genuine and good person that he was. And then he said, I quote, I know I used to be a handful, a bully, but let's be honest, if I were evil enough to rape and kill a teenager, I wouldn't have been able to be a firefighter for 15 plus years. I wouldn't have been able to work as a person whose job is to help others. I proved many times that I'm able to lay down my own life to save those in need. End of quote. And to that, I will add what Norbert's neighbor said about him to a journalist. I quote, I think, although I'm not sure if that's Norbert's case, that if one does something really bad, then they try to make up for it by doing plenty of good deeds, so that no one considers them a bad person. End of quote. Having that in mind, I have a theory about Norbert. I think he knows very well what he did, but because at some point in his life he started playing the role of a model citizen, husband, father, taxpayer, he might believe that he paid his debt to society off, that he repented and atoned for his sins. So now he can deny any participation in Małgosia's murder because that was his past life. He was a different person back then. The person he is now is unable to hurt anyone, as if he refused to take accountability for a teenager he used to be because now he's so different. Or there is another option, but the outcome is pretty much the same. Psychological repression, which would mean that Norbert Basiura might actually believe his innocence at this point because of his exceptionally good behavior lasting his entire life, which convinced him that participating in a group rape and murder is out of his character. Let me remind you what he said to the prosecutor. If I were evil enough to rape and kill a teenager, I wouldn't have been able to be a firefighter for 15 plus years. I believe that it's possible that he pushed that memory out of his mind because at some point he realized, it couldn't have been me. I'm a good person. I save lives. It has to be someone else. So he's either cynical or in denial. Either way, he wasn't willing to help the police resolve the murder case that, as he claimed, pained him so much. And why do I say that about his unwillingness to help resolve the case? Well, it's because Norbert changed his mind a couple of times about what happened on the night when Małgosia Kwiatkowska died. After his first interrogation as a suspect, when everybody thought they were done for the day and Norbert was waiting for a van to bring him to remand prison, Norbert was approached by Officer Remik. The two men had known each other for a few months then, because before he was arrested, Norbert would be summoned a few times to the prosecutor's office as a witness. He was also asked for his DNA sample then, which he gave without a problem, by the way. This would be later used as an argument to prove that Norbert was innocent and someone tried to set him up. The fact that he didn't hesitate to take part in the DNA testing because he had nothing to hide. In my opinion, Norbert thought that after 20 years it would be impossible to collect any of his old DNA, and no sample after such a long time would give answers on what happened that night. Well, he was wrong. So anyway, Norbert was done with his interrogation, waiting for the van, and was approached by Remik. What's important is that Remik and Norbert kind of clicked straight away, as they were both with uniformed services. One was a firefighter, the other a police officer. You know how it is. Norbert felt that Remik was someone he could trust, someone who was on his side, for God knows what reason, because looking at his actions so far, it's safe to assume that Remik was on the side of the truth and the victims, not the perpetrators. So Remik sat by Norbert and said, "Tell them how it was. Tell them the truth. Don't forget that the first interrogation is important." And apparently, Norbert took it as his cue to change his testimony. That same day, he got back to the interrogation room and told the prosecutor, apparently, as he later explained, hoping that they would let him go home afterwards. He told the prosecutor that on the night when Małgosia was murdered, he got really drunk, and that it was normal for him and his fellow bouncers to get drunk on those days, or those nights, when they were supposed to be security. But that wasn't all. As Norbert explained, being a bouncer at the Alcatraz disco elevated you from being an average guy to a popular guy. Girls just loved it. And it often happened that girls would accompany the bouncers during their own private parties, when they would hide away in a storage room and drink instead of doing their security job. Norbert said that he didn't remember if anything like this happened for sure on the night of the 31st of December 1986, but it was possible that some girls wanted to spend time with him that night, which resulted in him getting very excited and maybe even ejaculating somewhere, because the girls would sit on his lap, try to kiss him, rub their bodies against him, and he was so young, so something like this could have happened, and that maybe Małgosia was one of those girls, and this is how Norbert's sperm got on her tights or dress. So first of all, Norbert presented this testimony as a theory, said he didn't remember, but speculated that something like this could have happened. Plus, he admitted that he blacked out for about 2 hours. So the prosecutor wasn't too willing to believe him. Second, Norbert eventually admitted that he could have abandoned some of his sperm somewhere that night, even though during his first interrogation, he said that the fact that his sperm was found on Małgosia's clothes, I quote, made no sense. He was also absolutely adamant that he didn't have sex that night. That he made clear. No sex, so of course, no rape as well, right? The last thing Basiura stressed was that if his theory about the girls trying to hit on him in the storage room was true, then he didn't remember or couldn't have known that one of them was possibly Małgosia Kwiatkowska. But let's remember that Małgosia was his neighbor. He probably had known her for years. So it all doesn't make sense. And let's combine it with the depositions of Małgosia's friends and Krzysztof, all of whom testified that Małgosia was with them the entire night, either at the dance floor, or sitting by the table with her friends, or outside with Krzysztof, mostly vomiting, and because of that, spotted and remembered by a few other disco participants. So there was still no logical explanation from Norbert as to why he ejaculated on Małgosia's clothes that night. This changed testimony didn't help Norbert's situation, and as you can imagine, he stayed in the remand prison for the next few months. His wife managed to get him a very good lawyer, which wasn't easy because of Basiura's charges in such a high-profile case. Not that it should matter, but it seems as though the lawyer actually believed her client, believed that he was innocent, and fought very hard for him for years. Norbert told her that he didn't do it, that he had never been to the R family's yard, and that it's all a misunderstanding. Norbert's attorney was pissed that she wasn't present during Norbert's first interrogation after charges, because she believed that her client was manipulated and made a stupid mistake admitting to the accidental ejaculation, which was something that he made up, as he later admitted, trying to exonerate himself and hoping they would let him go home after his confession. I don't know how he thought this made-up story that no one could corroborate could in any way help him. The lawyer was sure that pressure was put on her client to testify in a certain way, which Norbert confirmed in front of the prosecutor by saying that one of the police officers said during the interrogation, "It would be good if it turned out it was you." Remik, because he was supposed to be the said officer, denied those accusations, and later on, Norbert apologized to him in private and said, "Sorry, but that was our defense line." Trying to throw a police officer under the bus was his defense line. It was quite shocking for Remig to find out that Norbert was most likely one of the perpetrators, but the more he found out about Norbert, like even the situation with lying about the interrogation, the more it was probable to him that they had the right guy. For example, in 1997, Norbert testified that his job as a bouncer required him to patrol the premises neighboring the disco building, like private properties, private yards, as if someone gave a random bouncer the right to enter a private property, to patrol it. And what the hell for? The officers realized that already in the beginning of the original investigation, Norbert was probably looking for an excuse in case someone saw him at the R family's yard the night of the murder. The yard happens to be 400 meters away from the disco building, but it's 400 meters away to its front official entrance, because the possible back entrance is about 100 meters from the disco. Take a look at the screen so that I can show it to you on a map. This definitely can be considered a neighboring property to the Alcatraz disco building that Norbert claimed he was patrolling. Another thing is that Norbert had a history of throwing his acquaintances under the bus, like this situation with his future wife and the guy who was hitting on her. So it just added a layer of mistrust against Norbert. And one last thing. At some point in 1999, Norbert had a sample of his DNA taken for the first time, but there was no match, like I mentioned earlier, because a useless method was used to test it. So after he gave his first DNA sample in 1999, Norbert started saying, although I don't know who to, was it the police or just people from his circle, he started saying that his blood might come up, as he said, somewhere in the evidence material, because he would get into physical fights quite often back then. And during his interrogation in 2018, when he was told that his DNA was found on Małgosia's clothes, that was the first explanation he came up with, that it must have been blood because he would get into fistfights, so he might have gotten injured and a drop of blood could somehow land on her. He tried to build his alibi years before he actually got arrested, but it turned out to be futile anyway, because the experts found his sperm on Małgosia's dress. To tell the truth though, Norbert had every right to lie as a suspect and then a defendant. Because fun fact, a suspect or a defendant in a criminal case is allowed to lie in order to defend themselves, and they are not to be punished for it, as opposed to witnesses who face legal consequences for perjury. But even though Norbert was allowed to lie and build his alibi as he pleased, it never helped him because he would be caught every time, and it definitely didn't make him seem veracious. Which was also an opinion that a psychologist had about his testimony, the same psychologist who created the psychological profile of the main perpetrator, which later turned out to fit perfectly with Ireneusz Matuszak. The psychologist noticed that at no point of his testimony did Basiura manage to be natural and spontaneous. About spontaneity, I can understand because he was probably prepared to testify by his lawyer. They expected some questions, probably tried to come up with the best versions of answers to those questions, yet still trying to be truthful. Well, at least the lawyer who wasn't there and didn't know what actually happened and relied on her client's words. But the other thing was, he's being unnatural, and my understanding is that he acted a bit like a robot. Spoke without emotions, at the same time being visibly physically stiff and nervous. He picked and chose what he wanted to talk about. In general, the way he was talking about the events from New Year's Eve night in 1996 was extremely superficial, as if he tried to show that he didn't remember anything from that night. He also sounded illogical many times, tried to change the subject of the conversation, and avoided answering some questions without making it too obvious. He stuck to the fact that he was a member of security, as if this was supposed to rule out the possibility of him being a bad guy in any way. The psychologist also noticed that Basiura liked to play the victim. And it shows, even today, in the media. I believe this is one of the reasons why there are people who believe him, believe his innocence. I mean, look at him. Nice clothes, sad face, he had a respectable job. He was saving lives, had a beautiful family, in a beautiful house. Norbert Basiura is seemingly the polar opposite of Ireneusz Matuszak, a rapist, an alcoholic, and a lifelong inmate. As an adult person, as opposed to him in his teenage years, Basiura seems like an average, tax-paying, well-behaved citizen. So I understand why some people believe his innocence. But let me tell you this. Not being another Ireneusz Matuszak doesn't automatically make you innocent. It definitely makes you better in comparison, but doesn't erase all the evidence gathered during the investigation. And the DNA coming from his sperm is crushing. Plus, all the witness testimonies about him trying to blame others for what happened to Małgosia, especially this whole spiel with the Radio Wrocław journalist. When the prosecutor played the recordings of those interviews, Norbert Basiura started crying and said that it was all manipulated and that he didn't remember anything from what he said back then anymore. So the situation at that point was as follows. One person out of jail, 2 suspects in remand prison, and at least one person scot-free, given that one DNA profile found at the crime scene was still not linked to any person. Unfortunately, so far, the police haven't been able to find the 3rd suspect, or at least there has been no official information issued on that matter as of 2026. I know they're still actively working on the case. There were a few other men checked more thoroughly than others during the investigation, for example, one of Norbert's former buddies. But like I said, no DNA match so far. The problem is that there are many men to check, and some of them have left the country years ago. Some of them died. So it's exponentially harder for the police to get their DNA samples. But I certainly hope that the effort will pay off and they'll eventually find the 3rd person. In March of 2018, the prosecution's office in Łódź, it had to be a random city, not in any way linked with Wrocław to ensure impartiality, started to investigate the entire 1997 investigation of the Miłoszyce case. They had to check if the original investigation was done right. We know it wasn't. If there was any bad will coming from the police officers or the ever-changing prosecutors working on the case. We know there was. And generally speaking, how it was possible that an innocent man spent 18 years in prison as a result of this investigation. And after 6 years, the prosecutor's office in Łódź closed this investigation and stated that nobody was getting punished for what happened in 1997 because there was no proof that anyone involved wanted to hurt Komendy on purpose. According to the prosecutor from Łódź, Tomasz Komenda wasn't put in jail because of anyone's bad will, but because of the evidence available at the time. So no one's really responsible for wasting Komenda's life in prison. Like, it was an accident. I will not comment on that part any further because it makes me angry. It's about time to talk about the trial. We've been waiting for this for 4 episodes. I mean, of course, there was one trial in this case already, but we all know how it ended. This time, it finally seemed that the right people were put in the prisoner's dock. Although during the trial, only one of the defendants was an actual prisoner, and I don't mean the fact that Ireneusz Matuszak had already been serving time for another rape when he was charged with the rape and murder of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. What I mean is that usually when people have such serious charges brought against them, like in this case, they get arrested and put in remand prison to wait there for their trial. It is up to the judge to decide whether a certain defendant should be isolated for the time of and before the trial, for example, if they seem dangerous, or if there is a risk that the defendant might try to flee the country. If it's not a high-profile case, the judge can set bail for the defendant or police supervision instead of having them stay in remand prison. However, it almost never happens for someone charged with murder to be released pending trial. Almost. Because Norbert Basiura is one of the very few exceptions. Told you he had a good lawyer. This guy was arrested in September 2018, and ever since that moment, his lawyer tried to undermine every piece of evidence the police and the prosecution gathered during the years of the investigation, starting with the Crown evidence, the DNA coming from Basiura's sperm that was found on the victim's clothing. For whatever reason, the lawyer, claimed that the tests were questionable, unsolid. I don't know on what grounds she claimed that though, because she was just throwing adjectives without explaining what she actually meant. She also tried to prove that her client was manipulated during his interrogation, stressed with the situation, and that, in her opinion, they tried to do to her client exactly what they did to Komendy 20 years ago. The lawyer also recalled the situation when she and her client were waiting for one of Norbert's interrogations in the prosecutor's office, and at one moment, Ireneusz Matuszak walked past them. Apparently, the two men, Basiura and Matuszak, didn't even look at one another. So based on that situation, the lawyer claims that they didn't know each other, ergo they couldn't have committed a crime together back in 1997, ergo Norbert was innocent. To me, the fact that two men didn't recognize each other over 20 years after the murder happened is not proof that they didn't do it together. They might not have been friends in 1997. Maybe this party was the first and the last time they saw each other. Plus, people change over the years. They change drastically, especially if they abuse alcohol and land in jail every once in a while, like Matuszak. Norbert Basiura stayed in remand prison until the 24th of January 2019, so less than 4 months after he was arrested. His initial arrest period was supposed to be 3 months, but in December 2018, the prosecution filed a motion to prolong the arrest period, which is quite standard. They were also hoping that Norbert, being away from his wife and children, whom he truly missed, and locked up in prison, might eventually break down and confess who was with him on the night of the murder. But that plan, as mischievous as it was, never succeeded because the lawyer of Norbert Basiura objected to the prolonged arrest period, claiming that there was no proof or reason to believe that Basiura might in any way interfere with the investigation or try to flee the country. So unless the prosecution wished to interrogate him once again, or present any new pieces of evidence, her client should be allowed to wait for the trial at home. And it worked. He was let go. Just like I said earlier, not being another Ireneusz Matuszak really helps you when you look at the two of them. A clean shirt and a sad face are apparently enough to set you free from remand prison, even if you are charged with child rape and murder. By the way, it's very symbolic that the moment he was arrested, Norbert's daughter was 15, just like Małgosia when she died. The indictment was brought to the district court in Wrocław on the 26th of February 2019. The court appointed the first hearing on the 7th of May that year, but nothing really happened on that day because one of the jurors turned out to be the client of Matuszak's lawyer in a completely different case. A total coincidence, it happens sometimes, but to ensure that all parties involved are objective, impartial, and not associated with one another, the juror had to be excused and replaced with someone else. So the trial actually started on the 14th of May 2019 in the presence of all national media, as well as the families of the defendants, the family of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, and Tomasz Komenda with his family. I'm not surprised they wanted to see that, especially since for the first time, Tomasz wasn't the one sitting in the prisoner's dock. It was almost exactly a year after he was acquitted by the Supreme Court, and a month after he filed for compensation for his jail time, but to that I'll get back later. The trial started with the prosecutor reading the indictment out loud and listing charges against the two defendants, Ireneusz Matuszak and Norbert Basiura. Then, Mr. Kwiatkowski, Małgosia's father, read his statement. He pointed out that, after the first investigation, the police tried to give all of Małgosia's clothes from the night she died back to her parents, but they begged the officers to keep them and to keep them safe. They hoped that one day the stained dress and tights might help find other perpetrators, and as it turned out, they were right. The first person to be heard in court was, unfortunately, Ireneusz Matuszak. I'm saying unfortunately because telling his version of events and trying to convince the court of his innocence took him 3 consecutive hearings. He did it his style, talking absolute nonsense, claiming he's in hundreds of pictures taken at that party, which was supposed to prove he didn't leave the building for long that night. It's bullshit, by the way. He's not in any pictures. He was fantasizing about what could have been and what could have happened to Małgosia that night. He rejected all evidence gathered against him by saying his DNA was planted on the crime scene and demanded that the entire investigation be conducted once again. And of course, he called himself the second Tomasz Komenda, innocent and about to be put in jail. There was only one interesting moment during that hearing because I found out something that I had no idea about before. According to Małgosia's father, Matuszak used to live on the same street as the Kwiatkowski family for some time. All this time, Matuszak kept saying he didn't know Małgosia, that he had never seen her. but he admitted at the beginning of the investigation that he had heard about the murder. Małgosia's dad said that it's impossible he didn't know who Małgosia was. It was a small neighborhood, the same street. Matuszak even went to the fishing club right by the Kwiatkowski's flat. So he must have seen her, must have recognized her at the party. And also, and that's my thinking, if he found out about the murder, it seems natural to me to mention something during the interrogation along the lines of, "Oh yes, that girl. I knew her. We lived in the same neighborhood. It's terrible what happened to her." Instead, Matuszak kept saying he'd never seen Małgosia, that he didn't know who she was, as if he was trying to cut himself off from this case completely. Isn't that mind-blowing, by the way, that it's another neighbor? Just like Basiura. They both might have seen Małgosia as a little girl. They might have seen her grow up, and instead of protecting her as one of their own, they watched her like predators, waiting for the right moment to attack. Norbert Basiura had no questions for his partner in crime. He was allowed to ask them, but never did. He let his lawyer do the job. I know I might sound petty now, but it looks to me a bit like he was trying to build an invisible wall between himself and Matuszak, like, we have nothing in common, we're not the same. So that no one ever thinks they might have done something together in the past. Even their looks were completely different. Norbert, always elegant, in a shirt ironed by his wife. Irek, fat, bold, in a tracksuit. Another difference between them was the fact that Norbert agreed for his first and last name to be public in regard to the trial, which made quite a good impression, as opposed to Matuszak, who didn't want his last name to be public because, as he said, he didn't want to be recognized by his cellmates, which is ridiculous. And as you can see, his name is well known to the public. It's mentioned in endless books and articles on this case, not to mention the public registry for sex offenders, so I have no shame using it as well. So now it was time for Norbert. You need to know that from the get-go, the media, and understandably his family and his lawyer, treated Norbert as someone wrongly accused. As if no one could believe that someone who looks so decent and has such a respectable job could do something so horrible in the past. Before the trial, he would have journalists come over to his nice house and interview him about the events from 1997, then take pictures of him and the said house, which looked a bit like an exclusive on the prettiest lawn contest organized by Homeowners Association. You get the vibe. But this facade started to crumble in court. Norbert wasn't able to logically answer any of the judges or the prosecutor's questions. When the situation got stressful, some actual answers were expected from him, and it looked as if he was at a knife's point, Norbert would say that he was too tired and didn't remember anything anymore. He only perked up when it was time for his lawyer to ask him questions, and he got to tell a little bit about himself. He said he considered himself a hero, and also someone who wouldn't be able to rape and kill because that was not the way his parents raised him. He told the court a story about a drowning puppy that he saved from the lake, and that later on, the dog's owners thanked him in a local newspaper. He also saved people from a car that was on fire on the highway. And it all happened when he was off duty, because that's who he is. That's what he does. But the court wasn't interested in listening about Basiura's bravery, so after 2 hearings, full of lies we already know and there is no point in telling about them once again, it was time for another witness. The next witness was Krzysztof, the boy who accompanied Małgosia during the disco. To be completely honest with you, Krzysztof is a mystery to me. No, I don't think he was one of the perpetrators. Besides, I'm 100% sure that his DNA was one of the first samples checked by the police during the second investigation, so I think in that regard, we can rule him out. But there is another problem. If you remember from the first episode, Krzysztof was one of the people who changed his deposition at least once, but that was the result of a severe and proven beating he got at the police station. He first stated that the last time he saw Małgosia was when she was approached by her brother. Then, under pressure and beating, he signed a confession in which he had had sex outdoors with Małgosia that night. However, he called it off later on. But I don't know if you remember that Krzysztof produced the third version of events in which he admitted that he witnessed what happened to Małgosia because it so happened that the night she died, Krzysztof met another girl and spent time with her, so to speak, which happened to be in a barn on the R family's yard. But he didn't say that to the police. He said that to the Radio Wrocław journalist, just like Norbert. And he never went to the police to confess it. Why? I don't know. That's why Krzysztof is a mystery to me. Was this last version made up? If so, by whom? Krzysztof or the journalist? If by Krzysztof, what for? Or maybe it was true. That would explain why the polygraph test revealed that Krzysztof and his best friend Andrzej probably had knowledge of what happened on New Year's Eve night 1996. Maybe Krzysztof was scared. And maybe so was the girl he was with then. Which is a shame because that would mean there is a possibility that two people were eyewitnesses to what happened to Małgosia. They would be able to tell who was there, how many people were there. But also if they saw it, that would mean that they were too afraid to go and help her, even after Małgosia was left alone. Or maybe they managed to escape from the bar before it ended. But if the polygraph test revealed the truth, and neither the journalist nor Krzysztof lied during their meeting, that would mean that the men stayed silent for almost 30 years now. However, this is all my speculation, just to be clear. Krzysztof has never officially recognized Ireneusz Matuszak as Małgosia's fake brother. That is a fact. He wasn't able to describe him in too much detail back in 1997. He didn't recognize Matuszak in 1999 when he was shown pictures of Tomasz Komenda, his two brothers, and Irek as potential suspects, which, when I think about it now, is quite weird to me because at that point, Irek was supposed to be above any suspicion from the police, and yet his picture was shown to the witness. Would it be possible that within 2 years, from 1997, Irek changed so drastically that in 1999, Krzysztof didn't recognize him as the fake brother? Because the fact that they didn't recognize each other in 2019 is no surprise to me. When it was time for Krzysztof to testify, Matuszak got all excited and asked the court for permission to leave the prisoner's dock to carry out a little experiment, as he said. The court agreed. What Matuszak did is simply stand right next to Krzysztof. The point of this experiment was to show that Matuszak is a few good inches shorter than Krzysztof, which was supposed to prove that Matuszak couldn't have been the fake brother. Why so? It all came from Krzysztof's initial interrogation when he testified at the police station that the guy who took Małgosia away was taller than him. So, as Matuszak claimed in 2019, it couldn't have been him because he was shorter. That argument doesn't convince me because in 1997, Krzysztof was about 16, 17 years old, and boys that age still grow. So even if in 1997 Krzysztof was shorter than Irek, that could have easily changed over the years. Krzysztof was interrogated for 4 consecutive hearings, which was longer than both the defendants' testimonies. It got really stressful, to the point where for their second hearing in court, Krzysztof brought a lawyer. He didn't feel safe. He knew that there were still plenty of people in the village who found him guilty. He knew that Małgosia's parents were angry at him for what happened to her because they thought he should have taken care of her. And Krzysztof agreed with them. Even though Krzysztof's interrogation took so long, it didn't bring any breakthrough. The court didn't find out anything new on the case. Honestly, it looked more like an attack on Krzysztof from Małgosia's family and their lawyer, and the lawyers of the defendants, both of whom tried to make Krzysztof look more suspicious than Matuszak and Basiura combined. Krzysztof didn't feel like a witness, more like the third suspect, and told the court that ever since what happened in 1997, people stayed away from him and his family, and also that now when the new trial was pending, his son started to be bullied at school because of his dad. The whole family was scared. I think that fear is a dominant emotion when it comes to Krzysztof, and I suspect that it comes from deeper than just his neighbors' gossip and animosity. After Krzysztof, it was time for experts to testify, especially a forensic doctor, who once again talked about Małgosia's injuries, then the DNA expert, and a dental specialist. The DNA part is particularly interesting because, after all, it was mostly due to the DNA that the new trial was opened and that 2 new suspects were identified. The defendant's lawyers, both of them, wanted to know how it was possible that the DNA of Matuszak and Basiura was somehow preserved on the clothes of the victim after so many years. The expert explained that there are many factors contributing to the DNA material preservation, like temperature, humidity, and bacterial activity, and that yes, even after 20 years, it was possible to extract the DNA profile and have it compared with the samples from the defendants, as well as hundreds of other men. So it's not like it was a plot against any particular person, at least this time. But it wasn't a satisfactory answer to Norbert's lawyer, as she continuously tried to undermine the entire DNA testing in this case, for example, asking sarcastically how it was possible that in 1997, no forensic lab worker spotted the sperm marks on Małgosia's dress, and suddenly, after 20 years, someone found it, and it happened to be her client's sperm. How convenient. The expert replied that it could have been a matter of the experience of the lab worker who was testing the clothes of the victim 20 years ago, and also, it could have been a matter of the lack of the right tools. We were technologically behind, and the police in the 90s were notoriously underfunded. The lawyer didn't seem to believe the expert's words because she added that to her, it was weird that the victim's DNA wasn't found on her own tights, where one would expect to find it easily, whereas her client's DNA was found on the said tights. The expert had no idea what to reply to that, other than that he had no control over what he found on the clothes of the victim, and that he was not in any way responsible for the results. He found the traces of biological fluids, took 139 samples, and couldn't have known who they belonged to. At this point of the trial, even Norbert had a question for an expert, and that question was brilliant, in my opinion. Norbert wanted to know if it was possible to determine how long the sperm had been sitting on the surface it was found on. Was it from 1997, from before or after? The expert replied that there was no such test to determine that, which must have been disappointing to Norbert. Because let's think about what Norbert might have tried to achieve here. Given that he insisted that he was set up, I guess he wanted to somehow check if his sperm was recently transferred onto Małgosia's clothes. Because that would explain why nobody saw it in 1997 and why it preserved so well, right? But at the same time, that would mean that Mr. Basiura happened to leave his semen somewhere unattended so that someone else could sneakily take a sample of it and have it transferred to the evidence room, which is quite a disgusting thought, and I'm sorry about it. Did he have anyone particular in mind who could do it? For example, his wife? Because who else has access to such a private bodily fluid if not a spouse at their own home? Unless Norbert Basiura left his sperm elsewhere in someone else's companion to now wonder if it could have been taken away and used to set him up. And trust me, that wasn't the only ridiculous theory about the DNA, because Ireneusz Matuszak officially stated that to him, it was totally possible that Małgosia stained her own dress with his sperm. How? By peeing outside the disco building at the exact same spot he used for peeing. She squatted, and some leftover sperm from his urine must have stained her dress or tights. This man is insanely disgusting, and the worst part is that he loved making all those sickening stories up and telling them either to the police or in court, almost as if it was one of his kinks. The second Miłoszyce trial officially ended on the 1st of September 2020, so it lasted almost a year and a half. The court officially overruled all of the defense's motions to redo the DNA tests of both defendants, claiming the motions were completely ungrounded. Then it was time for the closing statements of both the prosecution and the defense attorneys. To me, the most powerful part of the prosecution's closing statement was a rhetorical question about what was more credible: all the biological traces left at the crime scene, or the defendant's claims that they were not guilty, especially when we take into account that, at the time of the murder, one of the defendants wasn't a respected firefighter, but a troubled 18-year-old with a history of battery and bullying, and the other defendant was an alcohol-addicted serial rapist. The prosecutor ended his statement by demanding 25 years imprisonment for Norbert Basiura and a lifetime imprisonment for Ireneusz Matuszak. Of course, the attorneys of both defendants couldn't agree with the prosecution's demand. The lawyer of Norbert Basiura complained about the rejected motions to redo the DNA test for her client. It stated that it must have been due to the rush, that the entire trial was rushed and carried out under pressure. I mean, I don't know, it was almost a year and a half, plus years of preparations and gathering evidence before the trial started, so what rush are we talking about? She then stated that the DNA was pretty much the only evidence against her client, and that was simply not enough, because she had serious doubts about the DNA testing. Plus, and she felt compelled to point it out, there is no evidence that the two defendants knew each other before the disco, so how could they possibly plan and execute the murder of Małgosia Kwiatkowska? I'm saying this once again, but I didn't find information on what exactly, according to Basiura's lawyer, was wrong with the DNA testing. Like, what were her doubts, if we were to put it substantively, logically, and scientifically? From her statements thrown here and there, I came to understand that Basiura and his lawyer considered the testing doctored, and the only reason was that the DNA of the victim was partly degraded, whereas Basiura's wasn't. But it is scientifically possible. What's also possible is that two random drunk dudes came up with the same idea of taking advantage of a girl who seemed like easy prey on the same night at the same party. They didn't have to know each other to do that together. They didn't have to be buddies. They didn't have to plan it. One could start it, and the others could join in. And no, Norbert Basiura is not the second Tomasz Komenda, because that was also what the lawyer said. They all like to say it. Ireneusz Matuszak's attorney also had his fair share of controversial, to say the least, statements. For example, he claimed that there was no such thing as Matuszak's modus operandi in this case, because when he had hurt women in the past, they wouldn't be teenagers, and he knew them all. They weren't strangers to him. Well, I beg to differ, because he abused his wife, whom he married when she was a teenager, and also Małgosia wasn't a stranger to Matuszak. They used to be neighbors. And the parts of Matuszak's MO that stood out were overall brutality and biting. The age of the victims didn't seem to matter that much. I think the gender of the victims was what mattered the most. Matuszak's lawyer also tried to convince the court that maybe what happened to Małgosia wasn't really a murder. Because, hear me out, those poor attackers, when they kicked her with their boots, dragged her naked on the ground, hit her, bit her, and eventually brutally and repeatedly raped her so that the insides of her body were also damaged, they did all this when it was dark. So how could they possibly know what they were doing to her when they didn't really see the result of their actions? Plus, initially, Małgosia tried to defend herself, so they had every reason to believe that she would be fine, not dead. Because how can an adult person predict someone dying when you leave them naked in minus 10, 15, or 20 degrees Celsius, not to mention all the injuries the girl suffered? Who could have known? It's moments like this when I'm most glad I'm not working as a lawyer, because I would lose my temper in the courtroom far too many times. Those breathtakingly logical arguments against convicting Matuszak and Basiura thankfully didn't work in court, because on the 25th of September 2020, the verdict was eventually announced. 25 years imprisonment for both of the defendants. The verdict was quite a relief for the parents of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, although it was announced in the middle of the film promotion about Tomasz Komenda, who, in their eyes, should still be in prison instead of having a movie made about himself. Which, by the way, was another problem. The movie was more about Komenda, rather than the Miłoszyce case and Małgosia, who seemed to be the least important person. That must have been heartbreaking, just as the realization that someone was making money on their family's tragedy once again. As you may imagine, neither of the defendants was happy with the verdict, and they both appealed the case. What's interesting, following the court order, both Matuszak and Basiura were handcuffed and transferred to jail straight from the courtroom. To Basiura's surprise, he was completely unprepared for that, and thank God his lawyer brought him a new toothbrush, just in case. But anyway, they were brought to jail, but after exactly 16 days, Basiura was released. How, you might ask? Like I said many times earlier, Basiura had a good lawyer. After she appealed the case, she requested that her client be released because the district court verdict was still not final. The appeal trial was ahead of them, and during the first instance trial, her client was allowed to attend all the court hearings as a free man, since he was released from the remand prison. The court agreed to release him again, and this is how Basiura was allowed to wait for the appeal trial from home, even though, technically, he had just been convicted to 25 years in prison. Situations like this almost never happen. Normally, he would wait for the second trial while already serving his time. But he was not only released, but also kept his passport. So in theory, he could flee the country while having been convicted for rape and murder. The prosecutors who were in charge of the Miłoszyce case checked that the judge who made the decision about releasing Norbert Basiura before the appeal trial didn't even read the case files, especially those containing information on the DNA evidence against the defendant, as if the judge relied only on the media coverage of the case, which was changelessly in Basiura's favor. However, someone eventually came to their senses in court because after 4 months, on the 16th of February 2021, Norbert Basiura was arrested again and kept in remand prison until the beginning of the appeal trial, which started on the 28th of April 2021. This trial was much shorter than the previous one and lasted less than 8 months. There were 2 interesting parts, the first one being asking a different forensic lab for their opinion on the DNA evidence gathered during the investigation. This was something that both the defendants' lawyers hoped for, that a different lab would come up with different results and conclusions about the DNA samples and the probability that those samples did not, in fact, belong to the defendants. Unfortunately, the second forensic lab confirmed what the first lab had already established, that both Matuszak and Basiura were at the crime scene and left their sperm there, which they both tirelessly denied over the years. The second interesting part of the appeal trial was a new witness who turned out to be a former bouncer at the Alcatraz disco. Long story short, it seemed that he could have been one of the perpetrators. What's more, this opened up a new lead about a minor local gang that could have had something to do with Małgosia's death. Unfortunately, when it was time to compare the DNA of the new witness with the DNA from the crime scene, there was no match. So the prosecution had to give it up, and they pissed off the former bouncer, who demanded a public apology from the prosecution, which he never got. Nonetheless, surprisingly, the bouncer never sued anyone for the wrong accusation. The appeal trial ended on the 1st of December 2021, and the verdict was different from the first time around. Both defendants were still found guilty, but the prison sentence for Norbert Basiura was lowered from 25 to 15 years. The judge said that even though he found Basiura guilty of raping and murdering a 15-year-old girl, he decided not to punish him with 25 years imprisonment because of Basiura's overall good behavior over the past 20 years. Every time I hear that a jail sentence for a horrible crime was lowered because of someone's good behavior beforehand, or the fact that it was somebody's first time committing this crime, I'm thinking that the bar is in hell. Because isn't being someone who doesn't rape or kill the bare minimum for everyone? If not, where is my prize, my distinguished service order, or even just a glitter sticker for not having killed anyone? What kind of an argument is this? The court decided that it was beyond doubt that Norbert Basiura essayed and brutally took the life of a 15-year-old kid, and yet took 10 years off of his sentence because Basiura was generally a good guy. Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds? He did it only once. Doesn't matter that this one time was enough to unalive a teenage girl and ruin the lives of her family, Tomasz Komenda, and his family, and that the consequences of his actions were irreversible. It was only once. As if this one time was enough to prove what kind of person he was. This is sickening, and it happens all the time. This is exactly what happened with Matuszak before Miłoszyce. He never got properly punished for raping women, and about the result of this leniency, you get to hear for the 5th or the 6th hour of this podcast. After the appeal, Matuszak and Basiura had one last chance to overturn the verdict and seek annulment in the Supreme Court. One last, mildly infuriating thing is that after the appeal court verdict, Ireneusz Matuszak was handcuffed and taken straight to jail, whereas Norbert Basiura, who was also convicted for the same crime, was again allowed to go home. And it's perfectly legal. Basiura was attending the appeal trial as a free man. Because of that, the court didn't automatically have to order the police to handcuff the convict and take him to jail, as had happened after the first trial. If he was trusted enough to be released from remand prison before the trial, the court was allowed to trust him to go home after the lost appeal, sort his life out, so to speak, and then order him, by mail, I think, when he was supposed to turn up in jail and start serving his time for rape and murder. It's quite shocking, but, like I said, it's legal. However, it seems as though the court might have changed their mind about Norbert Basiura, probably thinking that he might want to disappear after his still objectively long verdict, not long enough if you ask me, because instead of informing him about the date on which his jail time was starting, the court ordered that the police go to Basiura's house, arrest him, and take him to jail. It was on the 16th February 2022, so about 2.5 months after the appeal trial verdict. Still, quite a long time that he was allowed to be with his family when, at the same time, Matuszak was serving his time normally. Not like I'm pitying him or anything. But my understanding is that Basiura also filed for postponing the start date of his jail time due to his family situation and bad mental state, whatever both of those actually meant. It didn't work though, as you can see. Some people were apparently outraged that their favorite firefighter convict finally got arrested and sent to jail, to which the spokesperson of the district court, which made that decision about the arrest, bitterly responded that Mr. Basiura was convicted for the rape and murder of a 15-year-old girl, not for stealing a bike. So, what's with the outrage here? Matuszak and Basiura's lawyers filed for the annulment of the appeal court verdict in May of 2022. Now, the Polish Code for Penal Proceedings is very specific about the grounds on which the motion for annulment can be filed. One of the reasons for overturning the last and already legally valid verdict could be the fact that the verdict was issued by an unauthorized judge. And this was the argument that the lawyers of the defendants used. Were they correct to do so? Well, technically, in my opinion, yes. This is a political thing. Unfortunately, this was not the first time that politics got into this case. Long story short, some of the judges who were in charge of the appeal case were what we call them neo-judges. Those judges were nominated by the President of the Republic of Poland based on the recommendation from the National Council of the Judiciary, which, the council, was at the time heavily influenced by the far-right government. So they are not considered impartial or professional. What's more, our Polish National Council of the Judiciary was excluded from the European network of such councils. There were some serious concerns about the law-abidingness in Poland. Still are, to be honest. It will also matter later in this case. In October that same year, 2022, the Attorney General / Minister of Justice, because that's one of the same person in Poland, which in my opinion is an aberration, also filed for the annulment of the verdict, demanding 25 years imprisonment for Norbert Basiura and life imprisonment for Matuszak, since in his opinion, the verdicts of 15 and 25 years were far too lenient. And this is probably the only thing I can agree on with the former Attorney General, Mr. Ziobro. However, to tell the truth, his motion was also politically motivated. Anyway, a year later, the Supreme Court upheld the verdict of the appeal court in force. So Ireneusz Matuszak was officially, once and for all, sentenced to 25 years imprisonment, whereas Norbert Basiura to 15 years. Unfortunately, the motion filed by the Attorney General didn't work, and neither did the motions of the defendants. A few months later, in February of 2024, the lawyer of Norbert Basiura lodged an application with the European Court of Human Rights on pretty much the same grounds as the motion for annulment of the verdict that she filed with the Supreme Court. As it turned out, there were many similar applications with the court concerning the same problem, meaning the fact that the neo judges I mentioned earlier took part in issuing verdicts in Polish courts. The European Court of Human Rights did not dismiss the application. What's more, it treated the case with urgency and priority and used it to issue a pilot judgment in November of 2024, recognizing that there was a bigger problem with judicial independence in Poland. The pilot judgment contained guidelines on how to fix the issue, which also apply to other similar cases from Poland. There is also a deadline. If, by an appointed date, Poland doesn't fix the systemic issue with Polish courts, then the European Court of Human Rights will unfreeze Basiura's case and the other similar ones, and will demand compensation for the applicant. And this can be quite a painful sum for the Republic of Poland, and if we combine it with the rest of the applicants with the same problem, this might make headlines, and it definitely won't go unnoticed within the European Union. I don't know what the timeline is in Basiura's case, but in a similar case, which interestingly concerned the former president of Poland, Lech Wałęsa, it was a year, which was later prolonged for another year. Given that there was no news about the case in the media in November last year, it is possible that Poland was also given another year, so we might find out more in November 2026. One might think that a person who tries so hard to get acquitted, I mean Norbert Basiura, might also actually be innocent. Because as you may remember, Tomasz Komendy also tried to lodge an application with the European Court of Human Rights, but he missed the deadline. And he turned out to be innocent after all. I told you earlier why I think Norbert Basiura never pleaded guilty to what he did. I said back then that he either repressed that memory and doesn't want to remember what happened, and the fact that he was a good person all his adult life might have helped him with that. And I also said that there is a possibility that he's simply cynical, that he remembers well what he did, but refuses to take accountability because he might believe that working as a firefighter, he paid off his debt to society. The prosecutors who worked on this case hoped that Basiura would admit to having masturbated at a crime scene, to being a spectator to the crime, and that in return for a more lenient verdict, he would finally confess who was there that night, how many people, their names, and so on. But he never did that. With Tomasz Komendy, it was the same. He also never confessed to having been at the scene, but he's simply never been there. And there's evidence for that. Norbert Basiura, on the other hand, undoubtedly was at the crime scene. Why then? He never wanted to make a deal with the prosecution and help close this case, which would at least partly be a remedy, an atonement, if I may, for his past. I believe that the reason why Basiura never made a deal with the prosecution is simply that he had too much to lose. Because with Matuszak, that's simple. He's never acknowledged or apologized for any crime he committed, ever. That's just who he is. There's this saying, it's actually a quote from a very bad Polish movie that says, "When they catch you red-handed, tell them it's not your hand." And this is exactly what he does. This probably comes from his belief that every woman he hurt deserved this, or wanted this. With Norbert Basiura, it's different. I think the reason why he can't say, "Yes, I did it and I'm deeply ashamed of it," even if that was to shorten his jail time, is because he seems like a person who deeply cares about two things in his life: his family and his reputation. If he ever publicly admitted that he was indeed one of the perpetrators, he would 100% lose his family. He wouldn't be a beloved dad and husband anymore. He would become a monster for the people he loves the most, a monster who lied for years. His past might also destroy his family's life, because You know how people are. It doesn't matter that one certain person did something horrible. The entire family would be considered, how do I put it, contaminated. Even though his wife and children had nothing to do with the death of Małgosia Kwiatkowska, I believe they still would be rejected by their community. They would have to pay for his sins that way. Talking about the community, Norbert Basiura would no longer be respected. Nobody would remember him as a firefighter who saved lives. It wouldn't matter anymore. Now, for many people, he's still considered to have been wrongly accused. He's still loved, he's still respected, missed, even though he's in jail. When he comes out one day, he'll be nothing short of a hero. Truly, another Tomasz Komenda, almost a martyr. It wouldn't do him any good if he finally pleaded guilty and managed to shorten his jail time, because he would have nothing and no one to return to. But if he stays there, while still trying other ways to be released earlier, he won't lose what he cares about the most. So it's still a win, even at the cost of living in jail for 15 years, with his health slowly deteriorating, which is what I hear has been happening to him lately. We are finally nearing the end of the story. You guys have been so brave for having listened to all of this. So many hours of me talking, and I have been brave for having spent months researching and preparing those episodes. But before we go, I would like to close some of the threads I started in this story. In 2025, the parents of Małgosia Kwiatkowska filed a 400,000 compensation lawsuit against Ireneusz Matuszak and Norbert Basiura. The case is still pending. It has also been classified, given the very personal nature of the proceedings. I keep my fingers crossed that the family of Małgosia will get the money. They really seem to need it. I mean, the parents, who are now elderly people with a history of very serious diseases, some of which were definitely caused by the immense stress over the last 30 years. I feel it's important to mention what happened with Miss Dorota, the woman who falsely accused Tomasz Komenda of being the killer of Małgosia Kwiatkowska. The woman was most likely cooperating with the police in Wrocław and helped incarcerate an innocent person. She was called to the prosecutor's office before the second Miłoszyce trial, and you probably won't be surprised when I tell you that she didn't feel bad about what she did in the slightest. What's more, she said that from the start, she tried to convince everyone that if Komenda did it, then he must have done it with his brothers and stepfather. So, since the brothers and the stepfather turned out to be innocent, then Komenda must have been too. She also demanded the prize money for pointing at the killer at the same time. She said that the police thought in the 90s that they had caught the right person, thanks to her, so she was due money for that, in her opinion. Even though, at the same time, she knew she was wrong. She never received the money, and she was outraged. The prosecution wanted to explain her involvement in the entire case. Unfortunately, Ms. Dorota unexpectedly died in June of 2018. She wasn't old. She was 58. Officially, her death was of natural causes. The next thread is Officer Remik, the man who started all this and to whom Tomasz Komenda and his family were incredibly grateful. After the Miłoszyce case, Remik wanted to start digging another case, the shooting in the Ultimo boutique, in which, as it seems, as I'm sure, the wrong person was convicted. Unfortunately, life happened. The police are miserably understaffed, and Remik simply had no time to focus on the Ultimo case. Also, gossip started. Some people, including his colleagues and bosses, speculated that Remik received some lawsuit money from Tomasz Komenda, which wasn't true, but the atmosphere at work changed. In 2023, Remik decided it was time, and he filed for retirement from the police. What he does now is try to help people in their criminal cases privately. He also became a consultant for the Netflix series The Mire. The last thread would be Tomasz Komenda and what happened with him after he left prison. Everything looked hopeful in the beginning. He was surrounded by his family, started to learn how to live in a world he didn't know anymore, started therapy, gave hundreds of interviews, and was followed by journalists and random people pretty much everywhere, because when the news broke about his release, he immediately became a celebrity. Tomasz Komenda had a book written about him. There is also a book about his mom, Mrs. Teresa Klamańska, and on the 18th of September 2020, the film 25 Years of Innocence, about the Miłoszyce trial, premiered in the Polish cinemas. During a sneak preview of the movie, which took place on the 10th of September 2020, so a week before the official premiere, an important event occurred. Tomasz Komenda proposed to his pregnant girlfriend Anna, and she said yes. On the 30th of November 2020, Anna and Tomasz welcomed their first son. For the first few months of their life as a family of three, everything was perfect. But then, in February of 2021, the life of the family changed. You need to know that a year and a half earlier, in April 2019, Tomasz Komenda filed a record-breaking 18 million zlotys lawsuit for damages, 1 million for every year spent in jail, and another lawsuit for over 800,000 compensation. In February 2021, the district court in Opole granted Komenda 12 million in damages and over 800,000 as compensation, so almost 13 million total. Pretty much overnight, Tomasz Komenda became a millionaire. Dream come true, right? Who wouldn't want to receive such an amount of money when they had just become a parent and planned to get married? Unfortunately, according to Anna, the money Tomasz received from the state changed everything. Their relationship deteriorated, Komenda's behavior changed. Apparently, alcohol and drugs were involved. After a while, he went no contact with his fiancée, his son, and his own family, including his mom, who waited for him for 18 years. The only exception was his older brother, which in and of itself is quite a bizarre story because the facts are that after Tomasz Komenda got his millions, he started to buy real estate that, as it turned out, after a while, did not belong to him anymore, but his older brother. I guess we'll never find out for sure what went down there. I suspect Tomasz Komenda got completely overwhelmed with what was happening in his life. The fact that he became a celebrity, a father, and a rich man within a few years could have been too much. He gave up therapy and disappeared from public life. In the spring of 2023, news broke that Tomasz Komenda was in the middle of a cancer treatment. This information was confirmed later that year when Komenda was interviewed by Ewa Wilczyńska, the author of the most comprehensive, in my opinion, book on the Miłoszyce case, The Girl in a Black Dress. In the interview, Komenda stated that he was in remission, but lived in fear that the cancer might be back one day. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, and it must have been shortly after the interview. On the 21st of February 2024, at the age of 46, Tomasz Komenda died of lung cancer. I remember the moment when I found out very vividly. I was in shock. I couldn't believe that after everything that happened to him, he got very sick and died young. He got to enjoy freedom for only 6 years. Probably less, actually, since some of his time in the end he must have spent in a hospital getting aggressive treatment. This is so not fair. That's pretty much all I have to say about this. That is just not fair. Just like it wasn't fair what happened to Małgosia. How it changed her family. How convicting Tomasz Komenda changed his life and his family too. So many people suffered, so many lives have been ruined overnight, many years ago. The case has still not been closed. Even though the prosecution already had the right to close the case, they haven't done it. They're still looking, still searching for this DNA match. There were at least 3 people involved, maybe more. They will be found. I have absolutely no doubt about it. What I can say about Polish law enforcement agencies is that when they care about the case, they will dig to the core, till the very end. They are stubborn, they can be brilliant, and have something to prove now. Also, I think that until the family of Małgosia Kwiatkowska is alive, and those people seem indestructible, and God bless them, they will never let anyone forget about the killers of their beloved daughter and sister, Małgosia Kwiatkowska. This story is about her.